One goal of Northampton's Climate Action Plan is for the city to be carbon neutral by 2050. This plan addresses many aspects of resiliency and regeneration, but in this chapter, I will look at our greenhouse gas emissions that come from energy consumption. Where do Northampton's greenhouse gas emissions come from? These data are hard to calculate, but estimates were made for the city's Climate Action Plan. Together, residential and commercial buildings account for 70% of Northampton's emissions. Looking closely at the residential and commercial sectors, about 70% of emissions comes from heating or thermal uses. In other words, 70% of all our city's carbon emissions come from our homes and buildings, and 70% of that is for heating and cooling, mainly heating. The fuels being burned to heat, cool, and power our buildings are primarily natural gas and oil. Broadly speaking, to get to carbon neutrality, we need to use less energy, switch to renewable energy for all functions, and to use renewable energy, we need to switch over to appliances and systems that use electricity. I spoke to Chris Mason, Northampton's Energy and Sustainability Officer, about our city's sustainability work. I started by asking if his job had changed after the mayor announced the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050.
It changed the focus. In the past, the idea was to drive down energy use, basically keep putting in the most efficient systems you can, switch to the cleanest fuels you can, but you're basically staying with the same mindset. If you have boilers, you're going to go a higher efficiency boiler, etc. When the mayor made that proclamation and you look forward, you say if you want to be net zero by 2050, over the next decade, we're going to be installing equipment that will be here in 2050. And if that equipment is not net zero compatible, you won't be in 2050 in city facilities. So it changed the mindset. Instead of just trying to drive down use, it's basically how do we convert our buildings to non-fossil fuel powered buildings? And that's a whole different way of looking at it.
Massachusetts has been somewhat aggressive on what's called the Renewable Energy portfolio of requiring electricity to slowly increase the renewable energy content. Some of that is Hydro-Quebec, which isn't necessarily the most environmentally sensitive source. Some of that is nuclear power, which has its own challenges, even though it's carbon neutral. And a lot of it is large-scale and small-scale solar and wind, which is wonderful in many ways. We know long-term, regardless of what the energy source is, electrifying everything is the best way to be ready for increased renewables. So there's sort of two parts to this. How do we get the energy grid to be more renewable? Solar and wind in particular, hydro to a lesser extent. So how do we get the energy grid, the electricity grid to be more renewable? And how do we move people to get their energy from the electric grid? There's two big opportunities for changing the grid. The one which is totally outside of our control, other than residents lobbying for it, is the state needs to be more aggressive on the renewable energy portfolio. We should be moving towards a higher and higher percent. So that's all the state level, and we should be encouraging that.
Northampton, of course, will need legislation and program funding from the state and federal governments to be successful with climate goals. I asked our state senator, Joe Comerford, about how our state is doing when it comes to addressing climate change. She has been an advocate for stronger legislation and quicker timelines. I asked her if the main obstacle to moving faster on climate initiatives is money.
I think a fair amount of it is about money. I think a fair amount of it is also a belief that we can't turn these vast systems as quickly as we need to. So folks did the math. How many cars are on the road now? How many have to flip to electric every single year? How are we going to get, the MBTA to go electric? That actually is going to take huge, massive spending. But before that spending, lots of planning. Both the House and the Senate have interesting blueprints trying to tackle this existential threat to our future and certainly to our kids' future. What I don't think we have at the state level, I'll just speak to the state levels, I don't think we have the anger and the urgency and the rage of our young people. When I'm in a room with young activists, I think to myself, oh my God, we have to harness you. It's going to take more money than we have to do the kind of climate transition, the Green New Deal transition that we know we need and we know we can do.
At the local level, we want to do a community choice aggregation program. City councils approved it, the mayor's approved it. We're now studying how to move forward. It's the best opportunity until the state requires 100% renewable, and then maybe at some point we don't need to be there.
There's a thing called municipal aggregation, where a municipality can buy the supply, electric supply, for its entire community. And generally you can, in that case it gives you the opportunity to perhaps get better prices, perhaps buy greener power. Some activists in the community, again, the activists happened to be in Pelham, Amherst, and Northampton, had the idea that in other states people are using this concept to go further and to actually start driving down greenhouse gas emissions. It could produce a pot of money that could be used for ongoing outreach to the community. So instead of having someone just looking mostly at municipal buildings, we get a position that is looking continually at how do we help our residents take on mass save? How do we have our residents go farther than mass save? How do we address the landlords, tenants? How do we address small businesses? And continue with that. Don't have it be one at a time here or there, but ongoing. So that's one of my biggest hopes. The second biggest hope is if you do this, you get the data. The utilities have to give you the data because now you are doing the supply. This will give us data, and hopefully it'll give us data in the fine enough detail that we can then identify markets. Who needs help out there? Which buildings are really using a lot of power? And can we come up with programs that actually help them?
Once Northampton is operating under this Community Choice Aggregation Plan, or CCA, people will be automatically enrolled. Currently, residents must opt into the Green Up program to buy more renewable energy, and only about 10% do. With the CCA, people would have the ability to opt out and go back to the utility's energy mix. But if the cost isn't greater under the CCA, there would be no reason for people to do this. I asked Chris how much renewable energy is being generated in our city right now.
The city owns a number of arrays ourselves. We've got some small arrays on the middle school. We have a little larger array at Smith Vocational, which is actually used for education. The students can actually adjust the array. And we have an array on the James House, which is an adult education center. One on Florence rec fields. Those, we know exactly how much we're getting. We can track that, measure those. We know how much power we're getting off those. So the landfill, we don't own that. That's owned by a third party. It spins its meter backwards, producing these credits that you can only use to buy electricity. And they can't use them, so they sell them to the city at a big discount. So we have a large net metering credits for a PV array on the landfill, and then we have one out of town in Spencer, Massachusetts. We're driving down our electric costs by a 30 or 40%. So we know about how much these arrays are going to produce. So we've sized it. We've sized the net metering contracts to cover about 70% of the city's electrical load. So it gives us a buffer to actually reduce electrical use. And for everybody who's out there who's put in a renewable energy, solar array on their house, you're probably selling your SRECs. The utilities probably have to be able to claim that renewable power, but that solar wouldn't be there if you didn't invest in it. Same with the city. There would not be more solar out there if we didn't invest in it. You have empowered more renewable energy, and we should keep doing that.
Most of our city's greenhouse gas emissions come from our buildings. I will look at the low carbon ideas for buildings in the next chapter.